Good afternoon. I'm Krys Boyd. I am host of a show called Think, which is available on more than 200 public radio stations around the country, via podcast everywhere in the world. Our episodes cover science and ethics and technology and politics and history and culture, and our focus really is on finding ideas and ways of looking at the world that our very curious audience may not have considered before. As we are actually capturing today's conversation, so I am very excited to introduce our guest. I know you have a complete bio available to you, but if you don't feel like messing with the QR code, Dr. Ian Robertson is a clinical psychologist and neuroscientist. He is Boone Pickens Distinguished Chair and co-leader of the BrainHealth Project at the Center for Brain Health at the University of Texas at Dallas. His books include The Stress Test and the one we will be talking about today, and that is How Confidence Works, the New Science of Self-Belief. Ian, welcome.
Hello, Krys.
Does confidence change the way our brains work?
Probably more than anything else, confidence changes us because it makes us do things in the world better, and that multiplies over time. It's probably the most valuable resource that a person can have.
People sometimes use the word confidence in place of hope or self-esteem. You think confidence is more powerful and different than those things?
Yeah, so optimism or hope is the belief that things will turn out. And self-esteem is your evaluation of yourself, a kind of audit of how good you are. But confidence, its secret sauce, is that it's linked to the action systems of the brain. It makes you do stuff. It makes you do stuff that if you didn't have the confidence, you wouldn't do. And that is its critical effect on the world. And that's why confidence predicts career success in a way that self-esteem does not.
You say that there are two elements to confidence. There's can do and can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, we're all here today in this surrounded by amazing technology and amazing organization of civilization. None of that would exist without this capacity of the human being to imagine states of the world that don't yet exist and to work to create them. So that's the bridge to the future that has got us here to this future, and it's our ever more necessary bridge to the future now. And the energy that gets us across that bridge is confidence. And so confidence is really at the basis of all human achievement and human civilization. And there are two strands to that bridge. We can call can do and can happen. And the can do is the belief I can do that thing. And the can happen is if I do that thing, the outcome I want will happen or may happen. And that, there was a wonderful quote from Arianna Huffington yesterday from Rumi, the Persian Afghanistani poet, who said that live life as if everything was rigged in your favor. And that's actually a beautiful capturing of something essential about confidence. It rigs the world in your favor.
I think most of us have the sense that confidence comes entirely from within, but in fact, it can be very much shaped by where we're born, when we're born.
If you feel, or if I feel that I'm here in this amazing Center for Brain Health, the University of Texas at Dallas, with these amazing colleagues doing this amazing work with the BrainHealth Project, if I feel that that is some cause for pride, that this is me, this is some unique achievement of me, then I'm a fool. I'm a fool. for most of us, luck and effort and chance plays an enormous part in where we are, and a bit of confidence as well. And so, success is something we should be grateful for. And if we have privilege, like I do, as living in one of the richest parts of the world, with the privilege of a very good education, with the privilege of having a family and parents who cared for me, an intact family, these are all, and of a particular racial group, a particular religious group, these are all sources of privilege that give me an enormous confidence advantage, and therefore a real life world advantage, for which I should not feel a sense of entitlement, but rather gratitude. And I should realize that other people who don't have these privileges are at a disadvantage. And gender plays a part here as well. Sex plays a part here as well.
We should just keep in mind that although confidence is something all of us want, it is not an unalloyed good. Like say, nuclear energy can do wonderful things and terrible things. Anything that works can work for, anything that's powerful can work powerfully well or powerfully badly. And that's true of confidence. Because confidence is such a powerful agent of success, which it is, it means that if you have a lot of confidence, then you will be much more likely to be very successful in life. And success breeds success in an exponential way. And that means that you can end up having too much success because actually of biochemical effects in your brain of repeated success experiences, which can end up generating too many or too much of a certain neurotransmitter that can actually disrupt our brains, particularly the frontal lobes of our brains, in such a way that it distorts our thinking, our emotional, and our social behavior. Why do almost all of us feel above average?
And Krys, so we should. Let me explain. We're all trapped, every human being and most mammals. Their fate is determined by the balance between two competing forces, between going forward in anticipation of reward and retreating in anticipation of punishment. And these two very primitive, basic impulses are in competition with each other in the brain. The reward or appetitive approach system is more in the left hemisphere and more linked to the dopamine system of the brain. The avoidance or punishment detection system is more in the right hemisphere and is more linked to noradrenaline or norepinephrine and other systems of the brain. And a healthy survival depends on there being a healthy balance between these two. However, what we find is in people who are not depressed, there is a slight dominance of the approach system. And so this slight advantage for, yeah, I can do that, nobody would start a company. We heard some wonderful technology startups at this wonderful meeting. Nobody would start a company if it wasn't for the fact that they're slightly more anticipating of reward than raw statistics would should allow them to do. Nobody would leave a corporation to do a startup if they were working on raw Bayesian statistics. They wouldn't do it. So it requires this thing that gets us up in the morning to believe I can do this, defying probability, the raw statistical probability. So we all slightly overestimate our chances of winning the lottery. The whole gambling industry is based on this balance. But it also means we feel slightly above average. And that's no bad thing.
I have read probably dozens, if not hundreds, of analyses of the Brexit vote. Yours really stood out to me. What did confidence have to do with Brexit?
Well, whew. So, you know, the economic recession of 2006, 2007, the crash, the UK government responded to that in a particularly austere way. They wanted to get the finances very quickly back to a certain equilibrium, so there wasn't too much borrowing. And so they savagely cut public services, youth services. They really cut them. And in many of the cities that most voted for Brexit were cities didn't have strong economies, unlike, say, the city of London had very strong economy. Many of the cities in the north of England, for example, and areas where there wasn't a huge amount of private enterprise, etc. These cuts in public services really had a huge effect on the fabric of society, and people felt this sense of collective loss of confidence. And the Brexit campaign very much harnessed that feeling of, it was a very rapid feeling. It was the biggest drop in the Gallup survey. It was the biggest drop of any country they ever saw over a 2-year period in this sense of thriving in their population. And so the people were feeling demoralized, were feeling lacking confidence about the future. And so the Brexit campaign offered them a very, I found rather pathetic kind of appeal back to the glories of the empire, of the British Empire, appealing to this sense of greatness that was based on not on greatness, we can do great things now, but on the past. And so it was a kind of ersatz confidence that filled the gap in confidence that these very, very austere cuts had caused. So, and as a result of that, there was this voting for Brexit gave people this sense of, we can do this, but it was not based on some tangible, we can start this company, we can do this, we can do that. We can do this with this fantasy of getting back to some kind of global greatness of the British Empire. And that would be one analysis of this, which I'm sure many people would disagree with, particularly, but which I think is probably accurate.
You mentioned fantasy, and there are a million self-help books out there that instruct us to fantasize about the thing we want to happen, the thing we want to achieve. This can actually backfire, you say, because rather than building our confidence, the fantasy fulfills our desire for feeling a sense of achievement.
Oh, that's a great question. And so supposing I, decide, I've started learning the piano late in life, and if I fantasize about performing in the Carnegie Hall, and that gives me a really warm glow, that fantasy. It'd be even better if I could sing in La Scala, that would be wonderful. But if I allow myself to engage in these fantasies, fine to have them, but if I take them seriously and that becomes something I'm wishing for, I'm doomed. I am doomed. And the data is quite strong on that for, say, things like weight loss. People who fantasize themselves being slim are much less likely to actually lose weight than people who actually focus on intermediate goals, who rather than wasting brain energy and fantasizing themselves, beautifully slim on the beach or whatever, rather visualize themselves just having that salad tomorrow at lunchtime, or visualize themselves putting on their tracksuit and going out for that fast walk tomorrow morning. That kind of visualization, which is the brain projecting forward a state of the world that doesn't yet exist, that accurate visualization and fantasy, that kind of fantasy, which is a mundane fantasy, actually makes it more likely you will achieve the thing. And similarly, for people recovering from hip surgery, the ones that fantasize themselves being pain-free and flexible, they're less like, they need much more rehabilitation in the end than those that fantasize themselves taking that first walk with the crutches or walking stick, who visualize the intermediate steps towards a goal. And that's why the advice of say, manifesting, of imagining yourself being famous, imagining yourself being, a gold medal winner in the Olympics, that's actually self-defeating. Self-defeating, and it's poor advice. However, fantasy, if you allow yourself a bit of fantasy first, and then you force yourself to think of the intermediate steps, that actually is quite a powerful combination. I'd love to sing in La Scala, but actually, however, I'm going to join a choir, and I'm going to improve my singing. That kind of combination, but a bit of fantasy first, but then the practical intermediate goal visualization.
It's easy to imagine a binary, right? We have confidence in a particular arena, or we have anxiety around that specific thing. You look at this differently. You think confidence can quell anxiety. So how does that work?
Well, confidence is actually the biggest antidote to anxiety, and anxiety is the biggest corrosive of confidence. And how does it work? Well, if I cross that bridge or start to build that bridge in my mind, the can-do, can-happen bridge, what I'm doing is I'm anticipating the successful achievement of a goal. Now, when I do that, my brain registers that in the same way as if I'd actually achieved that goal. And so what it does is it generates a little bit of the brain's reward network in the ventral striatum. You get a little increase in dopamine activity. And that has 4 effects. One is it's a natural antidepressant. It lifts your mood. Secondly, it's a natural anti-anxiety drug. Because of the increased mood, it lowers your anxiety. Thirdly, it makes you a little bit smarter, because of the dopamine particularly infiltrates the prefrontal cortex. And fourthly, it makes you more likely to take action to do the thing. And therefore, because you're less anxious, your mood is higher, you're a little bit smarter, and you're actually taking action, you're much more likely to actually be successfully achieve that. So then, you get the second double whammy. You get the second reward, boost of reward in the brain's network. So it's like they say about pessimists, they suffer twice. Once when they anticipate the bad thing, and then when bad thing happens. Well, for confident people, you get the double whammy of when you believe the thing's going to happen, and you can do it, you get that boost then, and then secondly, because you actually are more likely to achieve the thing, you get it then. Yeah.
For a while, we thought the best way to build confidence in children and young people was to praise everything they did. Pass or fail, win or lose, everybody gets a trophy. Why is that not as good as confidence built through mastery when mastery takes such a long time?
Yeah, great question. So there's data, and this is American data, that children and adolescents who in the first, say, quarter of their lives are blessed and have no adversity at all end up being more emotionally vulnerable as young adults. And not only that, if they then in middle age end up with low back pain, they're more likely to be long-term off work and heavy pain-killing medication. If you ask them to hold their hand in a bucket of ice water, the cold pressor test, they take it out sooner than they can't tolerate pain for as long as. So why is that? Well, there's another statistic. Children who have a Saturday job end up more emotionally robust as young adults. Why? Because if you're coming out of the cocoon where everything is, you're popular, you're academically successful, you're good at sport, everything, you've only known success, and then you go into the workplace, and there's a really nasty colleague, or a really horrible boss, or a really set of challenges that you're finding difficult to cope with. Of course you feel anxious. And you feel, if you fail at something, you feel a sense of failure. But if you've never experienced these feelings before, they can be terrifying. So you end up having fear of fear. And you don't know what to do with this, and you think there's something wrong with you. Whereas if you've had that Saturday job and, the other guy has really been very nasty to you, and some customer has shouted at you, you've experienced it. So it's almost identical to vaccination, but it's emotional vaccination. So kids need a bit of adversity. So if everyone's always a winner, if everything is always praised, and if it's always self-esteem, and there's never any sense of doing something in spite of feeling anxious. Nothing wrong with anxiety. It's a necessary, energizing emotion. If you've never had the experience of keeping going in spite of feeling low, or in spite of feeling anxious, then you end up, it's like not being vaccinated against measles. You'll get, the chances are you can get, really sick when you get exposed later in life.
Many people have tried to work out the reasons for different achievement levels on things like standardized tests. And this is really interesting. How can confidence, shaped by social factors, keep any individual from maybe performing to the best of their ability?
Well, this happens not just in standardized achievement tests. It happens in cognitive testing of older people, cognitive testing of stigmatized or underprivileged groups. It happens when women are tested for spatial abilities, for which they're supposedly genetically less competent, which is nonsense. Okay? So what happens? Why do all these things happen? It happens because if you're aware of a stereotype, whether it's a racial stereotype, a gender stereotype, an age stereotype, if you think someone thinks you've got dementia, for instance, and you're being tested, or you're made to feel old, then, and of course age has this stereotype, then suddenly your cognitive capacity, your frontal lobes, the working memory systems, your frontal lobes, are suddenly being interfered with by a number of things, including an increase in norepinephrine, which when it rises to too high a level interferes with focused thinking and memory. But secondly, you're having thoughts. You're having thoughts, what's he thinking about me? Oh my goodness. Some of them subconscious thoughts that sabotage your ability to do the task. And so there's one famous to me famous anyway, study of older people being tested on a screening test for dementia. And these were people in their 60s and 70s. And they were divided into two groups. Half of them were told they were in the older group, and half of them were told they were in the younger group. They were all the same age. And half of each of these groups were told memory problems are a feature of aging that are quite specific, that can be compensated for by using notes and things like that, and there isn't a general loss of mental capacity when you're older. The other one was a depressing article that said, aging is associated with a general loss of cognitive function, including memory. So you had 4 groups then: feel old, feel young, feel relatively young, and then told these 2 things. The 3 groups, there was one group, that was the group who were made to feel old and who were made pessimistic about the general effects of cognitive function. That group had about 65 to 75% failed the screening test for dementia. In other words, they would have been forwarded on to the clinic for full assessment. The other 3 groups, I'd say very low, 15 to 20% of them would be. And so that was just pure sabotage by the stereotypes associated with being made to feel old and being made to feel pessimistic about your cognitive functions. And that's why the BrainHealth Project, the Centre for Brain Health, is so critical for building the confidence, particularly of older people, to realize their brains are plastic and can develop and expand and improve, as a result of what they do to it. They have to have the confidence to do that. But also younger people who are maybe anxious, maybe suffering from stigma of certain neurodevelopmental problems, or race, or culture, or socioeconomic status. So the confidence is central to the business of harnessing the plasticity of our brain to improve it.
You share this story in the book about going to the gym and being able to lift a lot more weight when your trainer was there than when you were by yourself.
Oh, yeah, that was terrible. So they had the local gym had a free, you could go for a free assessment. I didn't go to I'd never been to the gym, so I thought, I'll go for it. So I went along for a assessment to see whether I would join the gym. And it was this very attractive young woman, trainer in her train suit. She sort of said, right, we'll go down and set. So went into the treadmill and set the speed, and she said, okay, how's that? And I said, yeah, I know, I can a bit faster. How's that? No, I can go faster. And then went on to the weights, and she said, oh, I can pull that. Yeah, I'll pull. Is that okay? No, a bit heavier. I can do one more. So anyway, we went through the whole thing, and so I came back a week later on my own. I signed up for the gym and said, right, going to do it. And she had left my program there for me. So I went on forward. I thought, I'll do the weights first. Went on to the weights. And I could not lift. There's something wrong with this machine. So I thought, I'll let them repair it. So I went onto the treadmill, pressed the button, set the speed, onto the treadmill. I was catapulted off the treadmill completely. So I realized that our physical capacity is actually hugely shaped by our expectations for ourselves. And this, my kind of rather pathetic and vain illusions about this young woman, I obviously stretched these expectations, allowed me to perform in the first session, but they weren't there in the second, and so I failed. But we actually know that confidence affects our physical performance, and say our endurance, for instance. And the great thing is, you can actually learn. Confidence is a series of habits, mental and physical, that you can learn. Yeah. So I wish I'd learned them.
We'll talk about how we can learn confidence in a minute. I do want to go back to aging, though, because we talked about cognitive ability and the way that confidence can affect our performance. There's also a mounting body of evidence that our physiological health is shaped by how we feel about the possibility for aging well. And I wanted to ask you how we know the cause and effect there, how we know that it's not simply people who already in their, say, 50s and 60s feel pretty healthy, exercise fairly often, how we know that they don't simply feel more confident because they already are likely to be more healthy than other folks.
Yeah, that's that's the chicken and egg challenge for correlational studies, longitudinal studies. And no one, the study I mentioned about the memory and the 4 groups of aging, that allows you to disentangle cause and effect because it was an experimental study. So you can say, in terms of cognitive performance, people who were made to feel old and who were made to feel pessimistic about aging and cognitive function showed this huge drop in cognitive performance. So we can say there was cause and effect there. But it's very difficult to do long-term. It's very expensive to do large randomized trials with thousands of people over 10, 20 years. So what you have to do then is look at the longitudinal studies that are done, of which there are many in the world. And there you find, there was one in particular, the Irish longitudinal study in aging, where they took people in their 50s and 60s, and they measured essentially their confidence about what aging entailed. Those who were negative in their expectations of aging, about, say, aging is associated with mainly negative things, if you like. So the standard measures for this. And you measured everything else at that time. You measured their physical health, their heart health, their social activity, their physical activity. So you can measure all these other things, and then you can have some idea that these people are roughly the same, the people with negative and positive expectations about aging. And then you follow them up, and see, and in this particular study, even 2 years later, the people who were negative expectations about aging had begun to walk significantly slower on a standard walking test. They had somewhat reduced their social contact, and their cognitive function had gone down. And these effects were all with all these other things statistically controlled for. Now, it's not 100% perfect because it's still correlational, and you're statistically controlling for these possible confounds that you were mentioning. But I think we can be reasonably robust. There's a whole lot of other studies in other countries confirming this view that people who have don't handicap themselves with negative expectations of aging will actually age cognitively and emotionally and behaviorally much better.
I want to talk about imposter syndrome. Years ago, I interviewed Madeleine Albright, the first American woman to be a Secretary of State, respected around the world, commanded respect and attention when she walked into a room. And she admitted when I asked her that she occasionally had this thought of, how am I the person who is in charge of all these things? Despite her qualifications and her brilliance, where does imposter syndrome come from in people who appear to be substantially confident in their own abilities?
I never want to be led by anyone who doesn't have a little bit of imposter syndrome. It is evidence of a healthy relationship with confidence and success. Because I mentioned the 2 halves of the brain, the appetitive, going forward, reward anticipating, and the punishment one. The trouble is, if you get too much power, if you get a lot of power, as tends to happen as you become more successful, and as confident people tend to get, more than less confident people, power has these distorting effects on the brain, and it has a number of effects. It can inhibit this right hemisphere punishment or risk perception system. What are the results of that? You get diminished empathy. You get an increased tendency to treat other people as objects. You get a diminished, reduced self-awareness. And actually, you get impaired decision-making and judgment, impaired judgment. And that's why, when I hear someone like Madeleine Albright, an amazing woman, say I'm relieved to hear that sometimes she felt she was an imposter there. because it was evidence that there was not this unhealthy imbalance between the two halves of the brain happening. And it's a real problem in leaders. It's a real problem across the world. We see it in leaders in non-democratic authoritarian regimes. They make bad decisions because their brains have been distorted with unconstrained power. And that's how democracies evolved. Human race evolved. The brilliance of democracies, where that power is constrained by elections, free press, independent judiciary. And of course, all authoritarians try and dismantle these things, and constitutional constraints. They try and do that. And that's why we need a little bit of imposter syndrome. Because the other thing about confidence is, it isn't to a certain extent an act. I mentioned the series of habits, so we discuss these later. But you can't buy into that too much. It's a bit like being a privileged, professor. You can't kind of own that 100% and take all the credit for it. You have to be humble and grateful for what you have. And if you're humble and grateful, you actually see that you're pretending that you have a solution to this problem, that the crisis that the company or the country is facing. You have to make that pretense in order to inspire people to collective action to sort it. But inside you're saying, I'm not sure I have the answer to this. But that's what leaders have to do. But they can't buy into that, believe in it too much. They have to have this little voice saying, you're winging it here, Jimmy.
Are there significant differences in confidence levels between women and men?
Yes, there are. Less so in America, much more so in European countries, particularly Scotland, where I come from. So, and women are hugely disadvantaged, enormously disadvantaged by this gap in confidence, because confidence is such an enormously potent, let's say, drug or set of habits. Yeah.
Well, that suggests, I suppose, that the difference is not something genetic or hormonal. The difference might be cultural. Well,
look, there's a certain heritability of confidence. There is a heritability. But like almost all human traits, there's a... I always just think, it's roughly 50-50 now. And for some things, it's 30-70, whatever. And women have, testosterone makes you feel more confident. In the same, I've never taken cocaine, but cocaine's a synthetic source of confidence. And cocaine activates a number of systems, including testosterone. And so women having lower testosterone levels have got this slight disadvantage, if you like. But it's largely social. It's largely social. And when I was writing the book, I thought I'll have a chapter on sex differences. And then I started to read the literature on this. And I just got dismayed at the range of impediments and, if you like, disadvantages that women suffer because of the fact that boys and men have this, for a number of complicated reasons, have this quality of confidence, if you like. And I can go into the details of some of the reasons for this. When I wrote these, it ended up being 2 big chapters in the book, and I asked someone to read them, a woman friend to read them, and she said, look, because they divided between internal factors and the internal psychology of the woman and external factors and kind of structural factors and all that. She said, don't start by kind of pathologizing women as if it's their fault they're not confident. Put the chapters the other way around. Start with the structural ones. So an example of a structural one is, in relationships, and this is American data, the male partner's well-being is proportional to the income distribution within the relationship. Mm-hmm. And it's optimal when it's 60-40 in favor of the male. Okay? But as the woman's proportion of the joint income increases, so the male's well-being goes down in the relationship. So that when the woman is earning all of the, it's as the male well-being is as low as it would be as if she was earning nothing. And this is part of the sex roles we have in society, that men, traditional men like me, are uncomfortable if we're not in the dominant position, and money is a real source, sign, token of dominance in a relationship. Now, this doesn't apply to the more enlightened younger generations. If people go into a relationship understanding that the woman's going to be earning more, and that's agreed up front, that then you don't have that negative effect of this lack of imbalance, if you like, in the relationship. So that's an example of a structural fact. The other thing is that another structural one would be that people's assessment of a woman's competence, or competence generally, people within a second, seeing a single face, will make an estimate of competence unconsciously, and when that assessment is hugely dependent on the masculinity of the face. And so women are seen as more competent the more masculine the face, up till a point, though, when it becomes too masculine, other people's rating of their competence goes down.
We cannot win.
We cannot win. And that's why, you say it like it is in the meeting to the pain who's just, and the man says it and says, oh, that's him, he's being firm. The woman says exactly the same thing. Oh, she's very aggressive. So that's the structural. The internal things. So just one example of that. Women, we know from brain imaging that women's self-representation is more embedded in their relationships. This is in Western countries. Collective countries are different. Men's self-representations are much more isolated. And so men can compete without much internal pain. They can ruthlessly dominate another boy or in a race, or beat another person. Whereas a woman, or a girl, when she's competing against herself, because it's harder for her to beat her friends, because her self-concept is embedded much more in her relationships. And that makes women on average more competition averse and less likely to enter competitions, and therefore less likely to get the winner effect. These are two examples. There's multiple more.
So as you're well aware, we have a concerning wealth gap in this country and a concentration of wealth at the top. And reading your book made me think about arriving at college as an undergrad and going to school with young people who had a lot more money than my family had, and being struck by the extraordinary confidence of the rich kids. They weren't necessarily better in school. They weren't necessarily better athletes or nicer people. Some of them were. But they just moved through the world with a certain kind of confidence. If young people don't come from families that offer those advantages, what do we do for them?
Well, I was that child, from a working class, council house, very unconfident, and I've only learned quite late in life to be more confident. And socioeconomic status is probably. Socioeconomic status and sex are probably the two things that most determine, and probably race, determine your confidence. What do we do about it? You realize, actually, your confidence is potentially in your own hands. Confidence is a set of habits you can learn. You can, and if you believe that, you can make yourself smarter, you can make yourself more emotionally resilient. All of these things are to play for because the brain is so plastic. And that's why it's so critical that people don't internalize these images of themselves, or they aren't trapped by their background. that they realize, yeah, that's a disadvantage, and yeah, these people who have a very privileged background effortlessly move through the world because, you know, they have status and they have money, and that gives you a sense of control. If you have a sense of control, that gives you confidence. Whereas if you don't have these things, then you have to learn how to climb up the ladder of success. But the thing is, if you do that, then because confidence, if you do things in spite of adversity, that builds a more robust confidence. So if you start from a less privileged position and you do the stuff to learn confidence, you will get a success, and you will get a resilient set of successes, actually, that will be very beneficial to you and to other people.
So give us some homework here. What are a few habits we can practice to build appropriate levels of self-confidence?
So critical is, what's in our minds is largely determined by what we pay attention to. And the reason that this reward system, the kind of left hemisphere anticipating reward system works is because we don't pay attention to downsides, we pay attention to upsides. So the entrepreneur that starts a company doesn't wake up in the morning thinking, oh goodness, maybe no one will fund me, or maybe I'll go bankrupt. They think, wow, I think I can achieve that. So you're paying attention to a positive reward. That biases your memory system to remember past successes. If you do the opposite, if you pay attention to downsides too much, that makes you anxious, makes you less likely to do the thing, and biases your memory system to remember past failures. So controlling your attention, and that's why the BrainHealth Project, the SMART training, the BrainHealth Project is so incredibly important, because it's about strategic control of your attention and learning habits of controlling your attention. So I'll give you one example of that. I remember giving my first talk after my PhD to a very distinguished audience, and a very prominent professor in the front row was frowning and shaking her head as I was speaking, and the words were falling like concrete from my. I was muddling, and I couldn't keep my eyes off her, and she was the whole time, and I honestly came away from that saying, "Oh, my academic career's finished. Obviously this is just nonsense. My PhD research." Turns out she was going through a bad time. The poor woman had ended up, going through early Alzheimer's. Actually, I didn't know that. But there was actually, there was many, many faces of people who weren't asleep and who were looking moderately interested in what I was saying. But because my attention was locked on, it was feeding this avoidance system of the brain, feeding my anxiety, depleting my confidence, depleting my performance. So attention is a critical one. So I've got about 10, 15 of them. We won't have time, but I'll give you a couple of other A's. One is your attitude to yourself. People who have, and this is the great Carol Dweck, the psychologist in Stanford, she came up with the idea that your theory about yourself has a huge effect on your performance.
The growth mindset.
The growth mindset. So people who have a fixed mindset, who thinks, a kid who's been told, oh, you're really smart, terrible thing to say to a kid, because it cements a fixed mindset. So they have, I have this thing called smart. And then they fail an exam. And what they do, when you look at their brains, what happens in their brains when they fail that test, they respond completely differently to a kid with a growth mindset. The kid with a growth mindset said, oh, I failed that, I wonder why. And they listen to the correct answer and say, oh, the correct answer was their hippocampus is activated, and they store the memory, and they learn from the failure. The kid with a fixed mindset, their brain goes, maybe I'm not smart. This is a threat to my fixed ego concept of myself. Their hippocampus closes down, and the medial frontal cortex is just involved in this self-esteem repair processes, and they remember nothing. They don't learn from the failure. And so you have to have a growth mindset to learn to be confident. Because if you think that your background or your current capacities define you, or your anxiety defines you, it's a thing you have, then you're not going to, if you start to learn to be more confident, to give that presentation or whatever, the first time you bomb at it, the first time you have a failure, you'll say, that proves it. That proves it. I can't do it. You know, I'm just not able. That happened to me learning musical instruments earlier in life. I gave up saying, I'm just not musical. It was rubbish. It's just, I had a fixed mindset about my musical ability. And so you have to learn to be confident, you have to realize the brain is plastic, that everything is learnable, and you can learn to be more confident, but you have to accept that learning takes a long, long time. Hundreds and hundreds of trials. And in some of these trials, just like learning a musical instrument, some days you'll feel you've gone backwards. But you must absolutely maintain that belief in the capacity for growth and neuroplasticity. And then, the actor mindset is another one. For a while there was some research claiming to show, or that did show, but it wasn't replicated, that adopting a power pose would increase testosterone levels and increase your confidence. So you saw some politicians, particularly some UK politicians, doing ridiculous poses. Savage Javid was one of them. Someone had told them, this. Turns out that research wasn't replicated. However, what has been replicated is that making yourself small depletes your confidence and depletes your sense of, I can do that. So that's why, if you're, and you'll see this in meetings often, that in the presence of a more senior or higher status person, some people will unconsciously make themselves smaller, and that undermines their capacity to perform. So even though you're a jelly inside, full of imposter syndrome, you have to stand tall. You have to stand tall, not in an exaggerated way, but in a proud way. And similarly, you have to, the next thing is to avoid seeking reassurance. There's an A in there. Avoid seeking reassurance. Habits that are much less common in America, very common in Britain and in Ireland. Before you say something, this is probably rubbish, but. Or I'm such a mess, don't listen to me, but. So this kind of preemptive strike to try and say, don't criticize me, and that devalues what you want to say in the meeting, So you have to bite your tongue. You bite your tongue and not engage in this reassurance seeking. Say what you think and believe in what you say. And that can be quite a hard thing, because these habits of reassurance seeking actually act in the brain to temporarily reduce anxiety. They're little verbal habits that kind of reduce your anxiety in the short term. In the longer term, they undermine your confidence in yourself, but they undermine other people's confidence in you. Well, if she doesn't believe what she's saying, why should I believe what she's saying? And so that's the thing. You were talking about these, these people from wealthier backgrounds who were, in college with you, who seemed effortlessly confident. Actually, a lot of them inside would have been, if you asked them, say, no, I don't feel confident. But they had learned the external manifestations of it, the fake it till you make it. That's so. There's and of course anxiety is the other huge thing to deal with in confidence. The trouble with, you can develop these habits of confidence, but if they haven't become really strongly ingrained, when you're suddenly in a stressful situation and you're feeling anxious, you won't remember to do them, and you'll make yourself small. You'll speak in the small, quiet voice. You'll seek reassurance because your frontal lobes are filled with, are disrupted by too much noradrenaline, norepinephrine, and you're not thinking clearly. So, this lovely little fix for that. You can change the chemistry of your brain. You can reduce norepinephrine levels just by breathing in for 4 and out for 6. Breathing in for 4 And out for 6. And suddenly the locus coeruleus, part of your brain that generates the norepinephrine, is firing less strongly. You're able to think more clearly because you've lowered these levels. And that and a number of other hacks, if you like, for dealing with anxiety can add to this portfolio of habits that constitute confidence.
We have about 5 minutes left on the clock. Would you answer a couple of questions
from
the audience?
I'd be delighted.
Thank you so much. This is just incredibly fascinating. Allison Messick, Navy SEAL Foundation. Can you talk a little bit about confidence in the face of mistrust, or like a lack of trust, or even how it's affected when you're in a trusting environment? There's so many external factors, as you mentioned, and I'm very interested in that. Thank you.
Wow, what a fantastic question. You know, the word confidence is really trust in yourself. So trust is, and confidence are very similar words. And trust in other people is really what allows us to work collectively. And that's, you know, if you don't have trust in a team or in a leader, then it's very difficult. You won't get collective confidence and effective collective performance. So, but sometimes you have no control over that. Sometimes the nature of the personalities, the nature of the structure means that you can't be sure of what other people are going to do or whether they're going to have your back or not, for example. And in that case, you have to define the things you can control and the things you cannot control. And there may be, maybe you can offline go and try and change the trust relationships in a team, for instance, by talking to a more senior person or something. But online, you maybe have to make a call on this. Say, I actually have to define a domain of activity in which I know I can trust myself in, but isn't predicated on the behavior of others if I don't trust them. And so it's about defining, and that confidence is always about defining a zone, an intermediate zone of not certain success, but likely success. I mean, confidence is essentially about pricing in has to price in uncertainty in the world, because the future is always uncertain. If something's 100% certain, then we don't need confidence. It's about bridging that uncertainty, but we have to define the zone within which that operates.
I think we can do one more here.
Ian, it's Eric over here. Hey, I wanted to say that I think that you're one of the best I've seen at explaining how the biology of our brain affects our everyday lives. So thank you. And for those of you that haven't read any of your books, I'd encourage them to do it. So thank you.
Thank you very
You
much.
addressed this a little bit, and you can give me $100 later for support. You addressed this a little bit, but how do you distinguish between confidence and arrogance? Because sometimes there's a interplay between the two, and confidence you're viewing as a positive thing, but arrogance sometimes may not be.
Yeah, overconfidence is a risk of because confidence is such a powerful source of success. The risk is you become overconfident, and with that can often come arrogance and even narcissism, and that's where people buy into the illusion that they are the source of their success as opposed to a whole lot of other factors there. And there are two main constraints on arrogance, external and internal. The external ones are governance. Now, in a family, within a family it's difficult, but within a company or a nation, it's governance. A chair of the board or a board overseeing a CEO, for example, doing their job properly and constraining that behavior and monitoring it. The others are internal, and that is a internalized moral code. And the evidence that there are internal constraints on someone's sense of power, and you can measure that in everyday speech by the proportion of nots, don'ts, and shouldn'ts in their free speech. And that is evidence of internal constraints on that risk of becoming intoxicated by power and too much success or wealth.
Ian, thank you so much.
Thank you.